wash me with your... Oh!
Okay, I'm against fraud. You're supposed to be charitable. There's a Bible verse for that. But let's hear what it has to say. Let's hear what it has to say. You've arrived on a very special evening.
To hell or heaven.
Listen closely, and us, we're going to watch a short clip from our good friend Doug Batchelor, where he states something that I've heard countless Adventists claim.
He has a good friend who is going to hell, going to burn forever because he doesn't believe the right Calvinist doctrine.
So listen closely, and then we're going to test and examine this claim.
By the way, I'm just trying to help you out. If you get to heaven and you talk to Jesus on after the last day, when you actually go to heaven, you're going to be really embarrassed having around telling people that God's going to torture them forever. It's going to be really embarrassing. You're going to turn red and look sheepish and shrink up. It's not going to be the best, I don't think.
The judgment hasn't happened yet. The idea that people go right to hell or heaven as soon as they die before the resurrection, before the judgment, is not biblical. And so, yes, we are in that group, and we're not alone. That was the belief of many of the Protestant reformers. But some of the mythological, the teachings of the Dark Ages that were in the church crept into the Protestant churches.
Now, before we hear the response, let's consider this. I wonder if Miles would call Tyndale and Luther liars. This is from Beyond Today. It's a Reformed website. I think it was, anyways, or the writer is, but I could be wrong. Let's see. But these are not controversial quotes or an understanding. So let me just read part of this, and then I'll make a point. So remember what Doug said, that you go to heaven or hell before the judgment and the resurrection is false. Let's see, let's find Dr. Luther. In 1517, Martin Luther posted his famous 95 Theses regarding the errors of the Catholic Church. In defending many of these later in 1520, he listed the idea, quote, that the soul is immortal, unquote, as among, quote, all these endless monstrosities in the Roman dunghill decretals. Luther's main concern in this case was the Catholic conception of the conscious torment of souls in purgatory, which he rejected. Yes, but people thought the immortal soul all the way back to the early church. They have posited that idea. So Martin Luther's just a liar. This is like, why wouldn't you take Doug Batchelor saying the same thing? The Protestants came out of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was teaching this idea. He's saying the Bible doesn't. Is he lying? No. He's giving his position. And he's saying a historical fact. The Reformers, because they came out of the Catholic Church, this is evident to most scholars about Luther. Many of the things he said in his 95 Theses, he changed later. He realized they were, we would call errors of the Catholic Church. That it's not. And why do we say that? Because we're Protestants and we say it's not biblical. That's what Doug Batchelor is saying. And the thing he's talking about is actually present if you actually read the early church fathers. There's some that argue about different details, but no one's saying Miles has been making it seem as though Doug and the Adventists are lying. Sorry, we can't explain all of history every time we talk about something. Many people don't know the history. I don't know it that well, but I know enough to know, there's more to be said. But it is true, in particular, as he argues elsewhere, Doug Batchelor, that the reason he's like, it's like an exhortation. It's like, look, you're only holding these views not because they're biblical, but because they came down to you through a system that propagated it. And now you're being a part of that system. So don't do that. Believe the Bible. That's not lying. Okay. It's the facts are that doctrine did historically come down through the Catholic Church. And yes, they're not biblical. And we can argue about that. But Martin Luther agreed. The Bible, show me in the Bible where it teaches that you have an immortal soul. Mr. Sola Scriptura. Oh, so you're a liar. Oh, you found some church father that believed that too. Some guy who was not a Jew that didn't know how to read Hebrew. It's like, dude, come on. Be neutral about it, because I'm getting sick of your fervent, fomenting people showing up in other live streams with your rhetoric. It's really ugly. So he says, also, it says here, I mean, I could read Tyndale, he goes on, but let's hear what Miles says. I better get back to it here.
All right, so Doug makes the historical claim that the belief that life continues after one dies is a mythological product of the Dark Ages. Is this true? Is that why Christians believe this? Let's examine the historical record, shall we? For those that don't know, the Dark Ages was...
So here's a question. Do you think, one, that Doug Batchelor doesn't know that people in the early church believed in the immortality of the soul? And two, is he literally trying to pretend like that isn't the case? Do you think if you went up to Doug Batchelor and you said, so are you teaching that nobody until the apostate Roman church was in charge believed in the immortal soul, or that you're conscious after death, or that, they were keeping Sunday before it was decreed in a civil context by a pope? What do you think he would say? Well, we'd have to tell the truth then, because you'd have him stuck. I mean, that's probably what you'd say? Like, are you serious? Are you joking? Are you being charitable? Do you really think your dad, Miles, isn't sincere? Do you think Adventists just aren't sincere? They don't care about the book? They sure seem to know the Bible better than a lot of other Christians I associate with, on average. Not always, of course. And yes, lay people say things like that aren't accurate. It's like, sorry, we're not all scholars. I'm not. You're not. So why are you misrepresenting what he's actually saying? Is that what's required to run your ministry? I read the comments in these videos, and you're inciting in people exactly what I believe we're to avoid as Christians by the way you present the rhetoric and the things you say that aren't actually true. There's like people in there like rawing that Doug Batchelor is a deceptive, lying cult leader. Are you serious, dude? And then you think Adventists are mean because they say you're supposed to keep the Sabbath, and that it's like you're a Presbyterian and you're like saying it's cool to like have fellowship with the Catholic Church, and you went to maybe they've changed their stance on that. Maybe they have. Maybe you're perfectly fine in fulfilling the prophecies of Ellen White by saying Protestants will join hands with Rome before Christ returns. And a final apostasy, like the Bible suggests, some kind of apostasy. Maybe you're happy to do that. You're so confident. I don't know. Seems like you wouldn't want to do that though. So I'll make some more points after we hear what he says.
A relatively long period spanning approximately the 5th century through to the 14th century. Doug, I don't know where you want to place this supposed myth, but let's grant you the earliest possible era, the 5th century. And that is being as generous as one can get. So we will look at sources only prior to that. In 180 AD, Irenaeus wrote book 2 of his Against Heresies.
So let me make it clear for those who care about the truth. Doug Batchelor is not claiming that nobody believed this in the immortal soul before the Dark Ages. Okay. I know it's fun to throw around numbers and then it sounds like you're correcting somebody. Doug Batchelor does not think that. I guarantee it. The quote was clear to me anyway. I'm surprised he actually played that part of it because it kind of refutes him. That the statement about it coming down through the Catholic Church, that's what kind of cemented it, just like Augustine cemented a Calvinistic way of thinking. Nobody before that had those sorts of distinctions in that way, as many well-respected Calvinists scholars have noted. They will make the excuse that Augustine developed what wasn't clear before, but is biblical. That's what they argue. So does that mean Calvinism is false? No. I mean, it's not what you'd prefer to be the case. It would be more comforting to know everybody was teaching determinism before Augustine and denied the libertarian freedom of the will is needed for there to be responsibility and a judgment that makes sense. Try not to sidetrack too much more than that. But so, I mean, I'm not sure what you're arguing. I think you're just trying to say Doug Batchelor's a liar for saying that, but he's not even saying what you're saying. You're claiming he's saying. And so you're spreading lies about somebody as though they're a liar. But in reality, the one doing that is you, either through ignorance or through being wicked. I'm not sure which. I mean that in a technical sense, though. You're being deceptive or you're ignorant.
Some backstory for those that don't know: Irenaeus was ordained by Polycarp, who we will look at a quote from momentarily. Polycarp was a disciple of John the Apostle. Irenaeus is known as the last living connection to the apostles. In chapter 34, titled Souls Can Be Recognized in the Separate State and Are Immortal Although They Once Had a Beginning, he gives us his understanding of Luke 16 and the rich man and Lazarus. He says, "The Lord has taught with great fullness that souls not only continue to exist, not by passing from body to body, but that they preserve the same form in their separate state as the body had to which they were adapted, and that they remember the deeds they did in this state of existence and from which they have now ceased." In that.
So is what's clear in this quote: the Lord has taught us very great fullness that souls not only continue to exist, not by passing from body to body. Now that is probably, I would guess, I'm gonna do my best to kind of exegete where he's coming from. That's actually the context of the verse, absent from the body, present with the Lord, what Paul says. He's making that distinction that, look, one can make the case, and I could go on about this and read papers on this. We don't know for sure. It seems to me, I'm going to lean towards, they don't believe the Adventist view, okay? So make that clear up front. I don't think I'm not making a case. The early church fathers believed like Adventists. I'm not making that case. Okay. Is that understood? But what the case they were probably making, certainly I'll try to speak to what they were certainly saying, according to various understandings of different denominations and their scholars, seems to me anyways, as far as I can tell, is that their emphasis was on the resurrection, the physical bodily resurrection. And I'll include a good source in the description on that. Okay, that quotes many of the church fathers and talks about the context, and is fairly unbiased. I would say they're more. It sounds like they're more my view, but not exactly the same. But the body to body seems to be speaking to the idea of what Paul says in the context, where we're not to be found naked, and then there's language referring to other places that's in the New Testament regarding when death is swallowed up in victory. He's clearly alluding to the resurrection when he's talking about the second body received. It's in store in heaven with Christ, John 14 sort of language, and that we receive it at his coming, at his appearing. 1 Thessalonians 4 and 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 Corinthians 15. You can tie in John 14 and some of the things Jesus said, Matthew 24, and the parallel passages. But that they preserve the same. You could argue that he's saying, because of what the pagan philosophers or the Greek philosophers like Plato, and you can look at my other videos I recently am doing, and I'm going to continue to read the paper I'm referring to. I've been reading it. There's 2 episodes so far, okay? That he's refuting a work of Plato that says souls, when they go into death or into the next life, if you will, it's not clear if the New Testament writers are using that language because it was like common language for talking about after death, and how much of that is correlated with certain ideas. But like I said, I'm going with that they didn't believe my view, okay? He's probably refuting the idea, according to scripture, of some of the things Plato is saying is wrong. Some of it's right. He's saying, when he says they're preserved and they don't cease to exist, he isn't arguing against Adventists. He's arguing against, or he's advocating that God is able to preserve the person so that on the last day, so that man can be resurrected to be judged for the things done in the body, according to scripture, right? The body must, there's Christology is related here regarding the nature of Christ and his redemptive work as a human, and as well as being God, and the necessity of the kinsman redeemer idea of him becoming fully man. And so Christology, it does come to bear on many aspects of this, and the necessity of redeeming. He has to assume what he redeems, and as what is being redeemed is the physical person, the whole person, whether you're a dualist or not. So he gives details about how he understands how that might work. You could argue they have some sort of body, but he's really looking to the necessity and importance of the judgment that happens at the resurrection in the body, and that he's likely referring to, like I said, the people at his time, like the Greek philosophers, who essentially thought it was a joke, that it was impossible to have a resurrection or resuscitation. And he uses this language that's very reminiscent of Job and what Paul seems to talk about when he says the seed is sown in corruption and it's raised in incorruption. In other words, your body goes into the ground because your body is essentially who you are, but you will receive a glorified body upon resurrection, and it will be your body. Some of the early church fathers in their quotes kind of mishandle that language and seem to think you're raised exactly the same as you died. But it's likely that they mean it's you, but it's a new you, but it's still you. And you're a whole person. That's because Job says, in my flesh, I shall see God. I will see my Redeemer. I know my Redeemer lives, and I will see him stand on the earth in the last day. In my own flesh, I will see God with mine own eye and not another. And then Paul talks about the seed and corruption. So it's you, but it's the new you, but it's still you. And so I think he's kind of having that in his mind. In other words, the pagan philosophers, the Greek philosophers, those things are foolishness to them who are perishing. That's likely to be applied here in this sort of thing, what Paul says. In other words, they want to emphasize that if God, because they talk about this, like Augustine even talked about this, and I disagree with a lot of what Augustine said, but his work on creation and the resurrection and how to defend Christianity, which is a big part of what he's doing against those mocking it. It's clear that he was exhorting to Christians to not be ignorant regarding these matters, because they're important to defend, and also he's wanting to refute people who are saying it's silly, it's impossible. In other words, we still have that today in academia with philosophy of resurrection, but don't get sidetracked. So in other words, Irenaeus is not defending against Adventists. He's defending against people who believe the resurrection isn't possible, almost certainly. And so context matters on these kinds of quotes.
That narrative which is recorded respecting the rich man and that Lazarus who found repose in the bosom of Abraham. In this account, he states that Dives knew Lazarus after death, and Abraham in like manner, and that each one of these persons continued in his own proper position. But if any persons at this point maintain that those souls, which only began a little while ago to exist, cannot endure for any length of time, but that they must, on the one hand, either be unborn in order that they may be immortal, or if they had a beginning in the way of generation, that they should die with the body itself, let them learn that God alone, who is Lord of all, is without beginning and without end, being truly and forever the same, and always remaining the same unchangeable being. But all
I don't think Miles realizes what Irenaeus is probably, this is almost certainly what I was talking about regarding the defense of God's ability to raise dead people from the dead. I'm not speaking to the conscious issue. I'm just speaking to what his concern is and what he's refuting. He's refuting the Greek philosophers who say things like what Plato wrote. I forget what it's called. I don't know how to pronounce it. I've never read it, but apparently he said like, it was a contemporary work that was popular amongst Greek philosophers that Plato wrote regarding when you die, you're reborn as a new person and you don't remember the things you did in your life, in the first life. And that is so speaking to that. He's saying that the person who you are now, who dies and is resurrected, that person will have the same memories and be the same person. And God is able to do that because he created Adam and Eve as fully functioning humans. And if he can do that, he can raise you from the dead. That's what the kind of thing they argued. Augustine argued it too after this. And so, yes, they are reacting to people who are saying the biblical promise is not even possible. It's not refuting Adventists who believe the soul. I mean, they may do that, but this quote is not. It's kind of like when you say the Bible teaches a flat earth, and flat earthers grab a hold of that. And then the reality is they're not talking about what they're talking about in a context that's saying there's no globe earth, it's a flat earth. But people read it that way because when they become a flat earther, because they're thinking, the Bible says it's a flat earth. Everybody's saying it's a globe. And like the early church fathers are refuting that. Or I mean, the biblical authors are refuting that. No, they're just describing what they see. They're describing the earth as they see it. And when you walk outside, you wouldn't know the earth was round, really, unless you were very careful, scientific, which some people were. And the philosophers and the Greek philosophers figured it out, for instance. So you got to remember, like, you want the words to be saying what you're talking about to refute what you think you're dealing with. But in reality, like, the context matters so much here because anyways, I just wanted to speak to that because, and you could also say that the idea that he seems to be emphasizing that humans did not have an eternal existence. He seems to be one, I would guess he's kind of emphasizing against that idea. He seems to mention it several times there, that their beginning of existence, but he's saying immortal, meaning that like you're preserved and you will be resurrected, I would argue. That's the important part of it. He may or may not believe you cease to exist. I think it is important for Adventists and to, I mean, the extinction of the soul, it's not extinct. Jesus said it was asleep. It's not literal language, but what is the metaphor? The metaphor is that he's going to the metaphor isn't that you look like you're death and sleep. Early church fathers kind of said that sort of thing. Like, it's a metaphor. Sleep is like a teaching of creation to show what happens when you die, but that you'll be raised up. It's not so much about, I don't think, in my opinion, it's more about Jesus made that analogy because the first death is nothing. It is but a sleep, but it is still, you die. And you die in the second death. That's why it's called a second death. It's like the first one, only this one isn't, you don't get woken up from it. It's permanent. You get thrown into the lake of fire in judgment, into the fire that consumes. And so He calls it the second death, which to me, language just means what it means. He's saying it's dying a second time. The difference is this death isn't asleep because you're not resurrected from it in the second death. That's the straightforward, literal reading of it. It is the interpretation of the apocalyptic book of Revelation. It tells you that's the literal interpretation of the imagery of the consuming fire. This is the second death. So that's what makes the most sense. But who cares what people believe? It's like, at the end of the day, it's what the Bible believed. And the whole point of this video is to say Doug Batchelor knows that the early church fathers believed in immortal souls. Okay. So stop lying about Doug Batchelor. I'm not sure. It seems like you actually think he's like purposefully lying, I guess. That's what your audience is getting from it, I've noticed. And it's like, please, man. Like, it seemed like when you first started, you were much more charitable and wanting to be careful. And I know how it is with people coming at you. It's probably easy to be more rhetorical, do rhetoric or whatever, but you don't want to be popular for that, dude. It's not what we're called for. It's not what we're called to. You want to refute ideas and steel man ideas. I want to see you steel man Adventists. Then talk about where the mistakes are. That's going to have way more useful. If Adventists are indeed wrong, that approach will have more lasting effect. If that really is what your concern is, if that's what your motivations are, it's the right thing to do. It demonstrates the fruit of the Spirit. It's careful, charitable, and being a fair interlocutor and having fair dialogue. It's okay to throw people a bone a little bit, but when it devolves into misrepresenting people and not being charitable, let's say it that way. Maybe he could have said it more accurately. I'll give you that. I'll say that. He could have been more careful to point out. It's not that it was invented. He could have said that. Maybe that's appropriate. Although, what's the context? I wish you would put your sources that you use so people can have access, who are good Bereans, if you will, or have that principle. You should provide, when you're quoting somebody in a limited capacity, you should add your sources to the description. I think that's fair. Because you're not hiding anything, right? You don't mean to hide anything. You don't mean to misrepresent, right? Seems like you're not being that careful. You're more interested in being, you're happy with just fomenting people's disgust. That's actually probably not appropriate, because it's not actually an accurate representation of what Adventists are saying. Don't you want to have better dialogue? Wouldn't you want to confront Adventists? How many are going to be willing to come on your show when they feel totally misrepresented? They can't claim you're misrepresenting them if you steel man them and you demonstrate at least an attempt to do that. So I want to encourage you to do that. Here I am with my intro. I'll play it just to be ironic and a hypocrite.